On the afternoon of June 12, 2025, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner lifted off from Ahmedabad, bound for London. 242 people were on board: pilots, cabin crew, families, and travelers beginning a long journey home or abroad. 32 seconds later, the aircraft was gone. What happened in those 32 seconds has occupied investigators for more than a year. Two healthy engines, moments after a completely normal takeoff, lost power almost simultaneously. An event so rare on a modern twin-engine jet that it immediately became the central question of the entire investigation. The cockpit voice recorder captured a brief, unsettling exchange between the two pilots in the final seconds of the flight. One asks the other why he had done something. The other says he had not. Neither statement has ever been fully explained. More than a year later, it still hasn't been.
This is the story of Air India Flight 171. What investigators have confirmed, what remains disputed, and what the world is still waiting to learn. The implications reach well beyond Ahmedabad. The aircraft involved was a Boeing 787, a type flown by dozens of airlines on long-haul routes across every continent. If the answer turns out to be mechanical, it touches a system fitted to every one of those aircraft. If the answer turns out to be human, it raises a different and harder set of questions. Either way, the global aviation industry has spent more than a year waiting for the same report.
Air India operated Flight 171 as a scheduled international service between Ahmedabad's Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport and London Gatwick, a route the airline flew 5 times a week. The aircraft assigned that day was a Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner, registration VTANB, delivered to the airline in January 2014. By the time of the accident, the airframe had logged nearly 42,000 flight hours, a well-used but unremarkable service history for a long-haul widebody of that age. The 787 itself is a significant aircraft in modern aviation. It was the first commercial airliner built primarily from lightweight composite materials rather than traditional aluminum, and it relies more heavily on electrical systems than earlier widebody jets. When it entered service in 2011, it represented a generational shift in how large aircraft were built and powered. This crash was the first fatal accident and the first hull loss involving the type in the 14 years since.
By 2025, hundreds of Boeing 787s were in service with airlines around the world, carrying millions of passengers a year on long-haul routes between continents. Air India itself operated a fleet that included multiple 787 variants alongside other wide-body aircraft, using them on its longest international routes, including services to Europe and North America. The aircraft's safety record up to that point had been, by industry standards, a strong one, which is part of why this accident drew such intense scrutiny from regulators and rival airlines alike. Both of VT-ANB's General Electric GEnx 1B70 engines had been installed less than 3 months before the crash, with roughly 28,000 and 33,000 hours of prior operating life between them. That detail, 2 engines with substantial flight history, recently moved onto this particular airframe, became one of several threads investigators would need to trace back through maintenance records. The flight carried 230 passengers and 12 crew members, 242 people in total. Among them were 13 children, 2 of them infants. Passengers held citizenship from India, the United Kingdom, Portugal, and Canada. In the cockpit were Captain Sumit Sabharwal and First Officer Clive Kunder, both qualified and current on the aircraft type. Weather conditions at Ahmedabad that afternoon were clear, with good visibility and nothing unusual reported. In the earliest phase of the investigation, weather was not identified as a contributing factor, and nothing in the later technical findings has changed that assessment.
Flight records show a routine pre-flight preparation. Boarding, pushback, and taxi to the runway proceeded with no irregularities noted at any stage. The aircraft began its takeoff roll, a sequence that lasted 62 seconds before the nose lifted. At 13:38:39 Indian Standard Time, the aircraft rotated at 155 knots and became airborne 4 seconds later. 3 seconds after that, it reached its highest recorded airspeed of the flight, 180 knots. To this exact moment, every recorded parameter matched a completely normal departure.
Then, according to data retrieved from the aircraft's Enhanced Airborne Flight Recorder, both fuel control switches moved from the run position to cutoff, 1 second apart. The effect was immediate and severe. Both engines lost thrust almost simultaneously, an extraordinarily rare event for a twin-engine aircraft, since each engine's fuel supply is normally controlled independently, specifically so that one failure cannot affect the other. To understand why this matters, it helps to know what these switches actually do. Fuel control switches are not used in routine flight. Pilots typically only move them on the ground, before engine start and after engine shutdown. In the air, moving them to cutoff starves an engine of fuel and shuts it down. By design, an action that should never happen by accident, since the switches are positioned and guarded specifically to prevent unintended movement.
The cockpit voice recorder captured what happened next. One pilot is heard asking the other why he had cut off the fuel. The second pilot replies that he had not done so. It is a brief exchange, only a few words, and it remains one of the most closely examined pieces of dialogue in recent aviation investigation history. Without thrust from either engine, the Dreamliner could not sustain its climb. Airport surveillance footage reviewed by investigators showed no significant bird activity along the flight path, ruling out a bird strike as a factor. The aircraft began losing altitude almost immediately, descending before it had even crossed the airport perimeter. 32 seconds after takeoff, the aircraft struck the hostel buildings of BJ Medical College, roughly 1.7 kilometers from the runway. The impact and the fire that followed destroyed the aircraft and severely damaged several college buildings. Of the 242 people on board, 241 did not survive. 19 people on the ground were killed and 67 more were injured. In total, 260 people lost their lives.
The sole survivor on board, a British citizen named Vishwash Kumar Ramesh, had been seated in 11A, beside an emergency exit. He later said the section of the fuselage where he sat broke away on impact and came to rest on the ground floor of one of the hostel buildings, allowing him to escape through a gap created when the emergency exit broke open. He was filmed walking away from the wreckage moments later, sustaining facial cuts and burns to one hand. Emergency response was immediate. India's Prime Minister visited the crash site the following day and met with the survivor and others who had been injured. Officials ordered rescue and relief operations, described as being carried out on a war footing. Given the number of British nationals on board, the United Kingdom's government activated crisis response teams in both London and India. Authority for the investigation fell to India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, operating under the framework set out in Annex 13 of the International Civil Aviation Organization's standards. That framework exists specifically to keep accident investigations independent and evidence-driven, separate from any legal or political process. It also typically draws in accredited representatives from the country where the aircraft and engines were manufactured, in this case, the United States, bringing additional technical expertise into the process. The AAIB has repeatedly pointed to this framework when explaining why the investigation has taken as long as it has. Two pieces of equipment made this investigation possible at all. The flight data recorder, sometimes called the black box, continuously logs hundreds of technical parameters: airspeed, altitude, switch positions, engine readings, many times per second throughout every flight. The cockpit voice recorder captures sound from the cockpit, typically the last 2 hours before any incident. Together, they let investigators reconstruct not just what the aircraft was doing in its final moments, but what the people inside it were saying and hearing at the same time. In this case, it was the combination of the two: the precise timing of the switch movement from the data recorder and the brief verbal exchange from the voice recorder
that gave investigators their clearest evidence of what happened, even as it left open the harder question of why.
A preliminary report, released roughly 1 month after the crash, laid out the sequence captured by the flight recorders: the timing of rotation, the movement of the fuel switches, the loss of thrust, and the brief cockpit exchange. Under Annex 13, preliminary reports are explicitly not meant to assign a cause, and this one did not. From there, the investigation moved into a longer and more technical phase. Both engines were shipped to General Electric's facilities in the United States for detailed forensic analysis, a process that took the better part of a year. GE Aerospace delivered its completed engine analysis to the AAIB only in June 2026, more than a year after the crash. Alongside that, investigators have been reviewing aircraft maintenance records, including the recent engine installations, along with operational logs and crew training and duty records, described by the AAIB as an examination covering technical, operational, organizational, and human factors. On the first anniversary of the crash, the AAIB issued an interim statement. It said significant progress had been made in analyzing flight recorder data, aircraft systems, and engine components, but it announced no cause and gave no date for the final report. India's civil aviation minister later told reporters the investigation was in its last stage, while stressing that the Bureau would not be rushed, given the international review steps still required before publication. At the center of the investigation is a single, narrow question. Why did both fuel control switches move to cutoff within 1 second of each other, moments after a completely normal takeoff? Broadly, investigators have had to weigh 2 categories of explanation. The first is some form of mechanical, electrical, or software anomaly, a fault in the switch mechanism, a wiring or sensor issue, or an error in how the aircraft systems registered switch position. The second is direct human action inside the cockpit. Each explanation carries very different consequences. If the cause is mechanical or electrical, it would point to a potential vulnerability in a system fitted to every Boeing 787 in service worldwide, with implications for hundreds of aircraft and dozens of airlines. If the cause is human action, the implications point elsewhere entirely, toward questions of crew psychology, oversight, and cockpit procedure rather than aircraft design.
Investigators also had to rule out other explanations before narrowing in on the fuel switches at all. The review of airport surveillance footage addressed the possibility of a bird strike. Flight data showing a normal takeoff roll, normal rotation speed, and normal climb performance up to the moment of the switch movement addressed questions of structural failure, improper loading, or loss of control due to pilot handling. None of those lines of inquiry produced evidence pointing away from the engines themselves. It is precisely because so many other possibilities were examined and set aside that the fuel switches and the question of why they moved became the central focus of the entire investigation. This is where the public record becomes more contested than the official one. In late November 2025, the Wall Street Journal reported tension between American and Indian investigators, citing officials who believed the evidence pointed toward deliberate action by the flight's captain. In late January 2026, Bloomberg News reported that, according to people familiar with the investigation, officials were leaning toward the same conclusion, that one of the pilots had deliberately caused the crash, while saying mechanical failure and sabotage had reportedly been ruled out.
It is important to be precise about what these reports represent. They are accounts attributed to unnamed sources, published by news organizations, not findings released by the AAIB itself. As of this recording, the AAIB has issued no official conclusion about cause, intent, or fault. The Bureau has consistently said its final report will only be published once all investigative work and the required international review process are complete. There is also a competing line of inquiry that has received less attention. The Federation of Indian Pilots has publicly stated that investigators have not given sufficient weight to one detail in the survivor's account: his recollection that the cabin lights flickered in the moments before the crash. Flickering lights could point toward an electrical anomaly affecting multiple systems at once, rather than 2 switches being moved by hand.
The Federation has called for that detail to be examined more thoroughly before any conclusion is reached. So, more than a year on, the central question remains officially unresolved. Did the fuel switches move because of a fault somewhere in the aircraft, or because of a deliberate act in the cockpit? Investigators have an enormous amount of data. Publicly, they do not yet have a determination, and every airline operating the Boeing 787, along with aviation regulators worldwide, is waiting for the same answer.
As of this recording, no final report has been released. The AAIB has stated clearly that it will publish the report only once all investigative activities and the international review and consultation process required under Annex 13 are complete. People familiar with the investigation have indicated the report could be ready within roughly 2 months of the engine analysis being delivered in June 2026, though the AAIB itself has not committed publicly to a release date. In the aftermath of the crash, Air India retired the flight numbers AI171 and its return service AI172, along with the corresponding Air India Express designation, replacing them on the Ahmedabad-London route with new flight numbers. The airline temporarily rerouted its London service through Heathrow before reinstating Gatwick service in late October 2025. Reports have also indicated that Air India carried out additional inspections of fuel control switches across part of its Boeing 787 fleet following the accident, as a precautionary measure while the investigation continued.
The lone survivor, Vishwas Kumar Ramesh, was treated for burns and lacerations and discharged from hospital 5 days after the crash. He has since been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a reminder that behind the technical questions, this remains, for the people most directly affected, an unresolved and deeply personal one. Beyond Air India, the wider aviation industry has been watching the case closely. Every airline operating the Boeing 787, along with civil aviation regulators in multiple countries, has a direct interest in whatever the AAIB ultimately determines, since the outcome could shape future maintenance requirements, crew procedures, or cockpit system design across the entire fleet. Until the final report is published, however, no regulator has announced fleet-wide action specific to this case, and the AAIB's findings remain the determining factor that the rest of the industry is waiting on.
What can be said with confidence is this. Air India Flight 171, a Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner carrying 242 people, took off normally from Ahmedabad on June 12, 2025. 3 seconds after reaching its peak airspeed, both fuel control switches moved to the cutoff position, 1 second apart. Both engines lost thrust. The aircraft could not sustain flight, and 32 seconds after liftoff, it crashed into nearby buildings, killing 241 of the 242 people on board, along with 19 people on the ground. What cannot yet be said with confidence is why those switches moved. More than a year of flight recorder analysis, engine forensics, and document review has narrowed the question, but the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau has not issued an official cause. Media reports describe investigators leaning toward a finding of deliberate action. A pilots' federation argues an overlooked detail points elsewhere. Until the final report is published, both possibilities remain unconfirmed. The purpose of that report, when it finally comes, will not be to assign blame. Under international investigation standards, its purpose is narrower and arguably more important than that: to establish, as precisely as the evidence allows, the exact chain of events that took 260 lives, so that whatever failed that afternoon, mechanical or human, does not fail again.